February 1943, a narrow mountain pass in western Tunisia. American tanks are burning. Soldiers who had never seen combat before this week are running, abandoning their positions, throwing away rifles and helmets as they flee. German panzers roll through the wreckage, crushing the bodies of boys who were civilians just months ago. Behind them, German officers are laughing. The mighty United States Army, the force that would supposedly win this war, has just suffered the most humiliating defeat in American military history. In the smoking ruins of Kasserine Pass, the Germans have killed or captured more than 6,000 Americans in barely 10 days. They have destroyed nearly 200 tanks. They have proven what the British have been saying all along, that American soldiers are useless, that American generals are incompetent fools, that these newcomers to the war are nothing but a liability. But here is what nobody watching that disaster could have predicted. The broken, demoralized force that fled through Kasserine Pass in February 1943 would transform itself, in a matter of weeks and months, into one of the most effective fighting forces the world has ever seen. The men who were mocked as amateurs would storm the beaches of Sicily and crash through the hedgerows of Normandy and drive into the heart of Nazi Germany. The generals who were dismissed as incompetent would outmaneuver the Desert Fox himself, and the army that ranked 19th in the world in 1939, smaller than Portugal's, would become the force that won the war. This is the story of that disaster, but more than that, this is the story of what happened next. The contempt that British commanders felt for American soldiers was not hidden. It was documented, recorded, and expressed openly in diaries, letters, and official communications. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, Chief of the Imperial General Staff and the highest-ranking military officer in the British Empire, wrote extensively about his American allies. His unexpurgated diary, published in 2001, revealed the depth of his disdain. General Dwight Eisenhower, Brooke wrote, was hopeless, possessed of a very, very limited brain from a strategic point of view. He considered the American Supreme Commander little more than a coordinator, a political figure incapable of making sound military decisions. When it came to actual fighting, Brooke believed, the Americans simply did not understand modern warfare. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the hero of El Alamein and the most famous British general of the war, was even more dismissive. In a letter to Brooke, dated April 4, 1943, Montgomery declared that Eisenhower knows nothing whatever about how to make war or to fight battles, and that he should be kept away from all that business if we want to win this war. He treated American commanders with barely concealed condescension, offering advice as if speaking to children who had wandered into an adult conversation. When planning the invasion of Sicily, British staff officers relegated American forces to supporting roles, assuming they would be unable to handle primary objectives. The phrase that captured British sentiment most perfectly was this: American soldiers were referred to as our Italians, a contemptuous comparison to the poorly performing Italian forces that had embarrassed themselves repeatedly across North Africa. In February 1943, after the catastrophe at Kasserine Pass, this assessment seemed entirely justified. To understand how America ended up in such a desperate position, you have to understand just how unprepared the nation was for war. The story begins not in 1941, not even in 1939, but years earlier, in the long decades of American isolation that followed the First World War. After the armistice of 1918, Americans wanted nothing to do with European conflicts. The war to end all wars had been supposed to settle things permanently. Having lost more than 116,000 men in that conflict, Americans saw no reason to maintain a large standing army. They returned to their farms and factories and believed that two vast oceans would protect them from whatever troubles plagued the rest of the world. Congress slashed military budgets year after year. The public had no appetite for military spending when the Great Depression was destroying livelihoods across the nation. The army's equipment grew obsolete. Training standards deteriorated. By September 1939, when Adolf Hitler invaded Poland and plunged Europe into war again, the United States Army had fewer than 174,000 men in uniform. To put that number in perspective, it was smaller than the armies of Portugal and only slightly ahead of Bulgaria. Only 17 of its 36 divisions were considered combat-ready, and even that assessment was generous. American soldiers trained with wooden rifles because there were not enough real ones to go around. They practiced maneuvers with civilian trucks that had the word tank painted on their sides because they did not have actual tanks to practice with. Their artillery pieces dated from the First World War. Their tactical doctrine was decades out of date. When German panzers rolled through France in May 1940, crushing the French army and driving the British back to Dunkirk in a matter of weeks, American military observers watched in horror. They understood, perhaps for the first time, just how far behind they were. The reasons for this weakness were partly political. Isolationism was not merely a policy, but a conviction held by millions of Americans. They believed, with a certain naivete, that if war ever came, their industrial might and democratic spirit would simply overwhelm any enemy. American factories could build anything. American workers could outproduce anyone. The details of how to actually fight a modern war could be figured out when they needed to be figured out. This confidence was not entirely misplaced. American industrial capacity was indeed staggering, but industry alone does not win wars. The Germans had proven that. Victory required trained soldiers, experienced officers, and battle-tested tactics. It required years of preparation that America simply had not undertaken. After Pearl Harbor, everything changed. The American military expanded with breathtaking speed. Millions of men were drafted. Factories that had made automobiles began producing tanks. Shipyards launched vessels at a rate the world had never seen, but speed came at a terrible cost. The army needed soldiers immediately, not eventually. Replacement soldiers who should have received 13 weeks of basic training were rushed through in just 8 weeks. Officers were promoted not because they had proven themselves in combat, but because they were available and seemed competent in peacetime exercises. Entire divisions were assembled from men who had never fired their weapons at anything more threatening than a paper target. They had no experience of what combat actually felt like, how the noise and confusion overwhelmed the senses, how carefully rehearsed tactics dissolved into chaos the moment bullets started flying. These were the soldiers who would be sent to North Africa in November 1942. The operation was codenamed Torch. It was the first major American ground offensive of the war against Germany. On November 8, 1942, more than 107,000 Allied soldiers aboard 670 vessels landed at multiple points along the coasts of Morocco and Algeria. President Franklin Roosevelt had insisted on this operation over the objections of some of his military advisors. American troops needed to be fighting Germans somewhere, and North Africa seemed like the safest place to learn. The reasoning was sound. The Axis forces in North Africa were far from Germany. Supply lines were long and vulnerable. Victory would secure the Mediterranean and protect Allied shipping. Most importantly, it would give untested American soldiers experience against the Germans without risking a catastrophic defeat in the heart of Europe. For most of the Americans involved, Operation Torch was their first time under fire. The landings themselves were chaotic. The first American airborne operation of the war was nearly a complete disaster. 39 C-47 transport aircraft carried paratroopers of the 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment toward their targets. Most of them never reached the intended drop zones. Some aircraft scattered as far as Spanish Morocco. Others landed on a dry lake bed, forcing paratroopers to disembark on the ground rather than jumping. The airfields at Tafaraoui and La Seigne were ultimately captured by ground forces, not paratroopers. Equipment was lost at sea. Units landed on the wrong beaches. Communications broke down almost immediately. Commanders could not find their subordinates. Subordinates could not find their commanders. The fog of war descended before the fighting even started. But somehow, despite all of this, the landings succeeded. The Vichy French forces defending North Africa, loyal to the collaborationist government that had surrendered to Germany in 1940, put up only scattered resistance. Many French commanders were secretly sympathetic to the Allies. Within days, an armistice was negotiated. French forces in North Africa joined the Allied cause. American soldiers celebrated as if they had won the war. They posed for photographs and wrote home about their great victory. They had no idea what was coming. As the Americans pushed east from their landing zones, they moved into Tunisia, the last Axis stronghold in North Africa. Here they would face not the demoralized Vichy French, but the battle-hardened veterans of the Afrika Korps. These German soldiers had been fighting in the desert for nearly 2 years. They had defeated the British again and again at places like Tobruk and Gazala. They knew the terrain, they understood desert warfare, and they had nothing but contempt for the untested Americans now stumbling toward them. Commanding the Afrika Korps was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, one of the greatest tactical commanders of the Second World War. Rommel had made his reputation in France in 1940 and had enhanced it further across the sands of Libya and Egypt. He was aggressive, unpredictable, and brilliant. The stage was set for catastrophe. The American Second Corps, responsible for defending the central sector of the Tunisian front, was commanded by Major General Lloyd Fredendall. On paper, Fredendall seemed like a solid choice for this crucial assignment. He had impressed Army Chief of Staff George Marshall with his energy and confidence. General Eisenhower had personally selected him for command. Fredendall talked a good game. He projected certainty. He seemed like a leader who could get things done, but appearances were deceiving. Fredendall was about to prove himself one of the worst American commanders of the entire war. His failures would contribute directly to the disaster at Kasserine Pass. Fredendall established his headquarters at a place his staff called Speedy Valley, 70 miles behind the front lines. The location itself was not necessarily a problem. Corps commanders often positioned themselves away from immediate danger so they could coordinate operations across a wide front. But what Fredendall did at Speedy Valley was unprecedented. Rather than focusing on training his troops, or coordinating with his subordinate commanders, or studying the terrain his men would have to defend, he ordered more than 200 engineers to spend 3 weeks blasting tunnels into the rock walls of a remote canyon. These tunnels were supposed to protect his headquarters from German air attack. Engineers who should have been building roads, or laying mines, or constructing defensive positions, were instead creating an elaborate underground bunker for their commanding general. The officers who saw what Fredendall was doing were appalled. They sarcastically called the complex Lloyd's very last resort. While American soldiers faced the Afrika Korps with inadequate training and scattered deployments, their commanding general was hiding in a hole he had ordered dug at the cost of thousands of man-hours. It was a staggering misallocation of resources at a critical moment. Fredendall's other decisions were equally disastrous. He split the 1st Armoured Division into scattered packets, spread across a 30-mile front, violating every principle of armoured warfare. Tanks are meant to be massed, concentrated for decisive blows. Rommel himself had demonstrated this again and again. Instead, Fredendall dispersed American armour like a thin screen that could be punctured anywhere. There was no reserve, no concentration of force, no ability to counterattack effectively. It was tactical malpractice. His communication style made things worse. Fredendall issued orders in a bizarre personal code that his subordinates could barely understand. He created confusing map references and used improvised terminology that appeared nowhere in standard military doctrine. His division commanders, unable to decipher such messages, often had to guess what he wanted. Precious time was wasted seeking clarification. Orders that should have been clear became subjects of debate. Most damning of all, Fredendall never visited the front. He stayed in his underground bunker, studying maps and issuing his cryptic orders, while his men lived and died in positions he had never seen. He had no real understanding of the terrain they were defending, the roads they controlled, and the hills that dominated the approaches. He did not know his soldiers. They did not know him. When things went wrong, there was no trust to fall back on, no relationship between commanders and commanded that might have steadied the line. Fredendall also feuded constantly with his subordinate commanders. His relationship with Major General Orlando Ward of the 1st Armoured Division was particularly toxic. Ward was a capable officer who understood armoured warfare. He repeatedly requested permission to concentrate his tanks for an effective defence. Fredendall repeatedly overruled him. When Ward asked to withdraw from untenable positions before they were overrun, Fredendall refused. The two men could barely stand to be in the same room together. Their disagreements were not professional debates about tactics. They were personal conflicts that poisoned the entire command structure. The soldiers of Second Corps would pay for this dysfunction with their lives. In early February 1943, Rommel saw his opportunity. Allied forces were spread thin across Tunisia, with poor coordination between American, British, and French units. The Americans in particular were isolated in exposed positions, their flanks unprotected. Intelligence indicated that American morale was shaky and leadership was confused. Rommel planned a double envelopment at a place called Sidi Bou Zid, where American forces guarded a vital road junction. It was exactly the kind of concentrated armoured strike that Fredendall's dispositions had made possible. On February 14th, the attack began. The results were immediate and devastating. German panzers struck from two directions simultaneously, catching the Americans completely by surprise. The defenders at Sidi Bou Zid included elements of the 1st Armoured Division, but they were scattered exactly as Fredendall had ordered, unable to support each other. Within hours, the American line was crumbling. German tanks rolled through gaps in the defence. Artillery positions were overrun before they could fire. Infantry units that should have been dug in were caught in the open. By the end of the first day, the Americans had lost 44 tanks, 50 half-track vehicles, and 26 artillery pieces. More than 2,000 men of the 168th Infantry Regiment were stranded on two isolated hills, surrounded and cut off from any help. Over the next 2 days, Fredendall ordered counterattacks that were doomed from the start. American tank battalions charged straight into prepared German positions without adequate reconnaissance, without effective air support, without coordination between armour and infantry. They suffered massive casualties for no tactical gain. The counterattacks did not relieve the trapped infantry. They simply added to the American death toll. The trapped soldiers on the hills tried desperately to hold out. They rationed their ammunition. They called for airdrops of supplies that never came. They watched German tanks circling below and knew that rescue was not coming. Without reinforcement, their situation was hopeless. Of the roughly 2,000 men stranded on those hills, only about 300 managed to escape. The rest were killed or captured. In just 3 days, the Americans had lost approximately 2,500 men, 103 tanks, 280 vehicles, and 18 artillery pieces. And the worst was yet to come. Rommel now pushed west toward Kasserine Pass itself, a narrow 2-mile gap in the Grand Dorsal mountain chain. This pass was the gateway to the Allied supply depots beyond. If Rommel could break through, he might be able to roll up the entire Allied position in Tunisia. Defending the pass were scattered American units, including the 19th Combat Engineer Regiment, men who should have been building roads and bridges, but were now expected to hold the line against veteran German panzers. The engineers had been busy, but not with defensive preparations. Many of them had spent the previous weeks working on Fredendall's underground bunker complex at Speedy Valley. Now they were rushed to the pass with inadequate weapons, minimal training in infantry tactics, and almost no understanding of the terrain they were supposed to defend. They had rifles, some had machine guns, but they were facing the Afrika Korps with little more than courage and determination, and courage alone does not stop tanks. On February 19th, the German assault on Kasserine Pass began in earnest. Italian troops, including the elite 5th Bersaglieri Regiment, led the initial attacks. The Bersaglieri were mountain troops, specialists in difficult terrain, and they attacked with ferocity. Their commander, Colonel Luigi Bonfatti, personally led a charge up the rocky slopes of the pass. It was the kind of personal leadership that Fredendall had never shown. Bonfatti was killed in the assault, a bullet through his chest as he urged his men forward, but his sacrifice opened the pass. The American defensive line cracked. German and Italian forces poured through the gap. The American defenders, overwhelmed and outflanked, began to fall back. What started as an orderly withdrawal quickly became something else. Men who had held their positions for hours suddenly discovered that the units on their flanks had already retreated. Soldiers found themselves alone, surrounded, with Germans on 3 sides. They ran. Equipment was abandoned. Wounded men were left behind. The road west was clogged with fleeing vehicles, lost soldiers, and the debris of a defeated army. Behind the lines, panic spread. Rear echelon troops who had never expected to see combat suddenly found themselves in the path of German panzers. Clerks and cooks and supply personnel grabbed whatever weapons they could find and ran. Military police had to be deployed to stop the retreat and round up stragglers. Officers who tried to rally their men were ignored or pushed aside. Equipment worth millions of dollars was abandoned or destroyed to keep it from falling into enemy hands. This was the nadir of American military performance in the entire war. But even in the midst of this disaster, there were signs of what the American army would become. At a place called Jebel el Hamra, Combat Command B of the 1st Armoured Division under Colonel Robinette, along with elements of the 1st Infantry Division under Major General Terry Allen, made a stand. These men refused to run. They held their positions against repeated German attacks, buying precious time for reinforcements to arrive. The 9th Division's artillery battalion completed an 800-mile emergency march from Morocco. They drove day and night, arriving exhausted but ready to fight. Their guns went into action almost immediately, and the volume of American artillery fire began to stabilize the front. On February 21st, the German advance stalled. Rommel had pushed too far, too fast. His supply lines were stretched thin. Allied air power was finally making an impact. And crucially, the Americans who were still fighting had stopped running and started shooting back. Rommel assessed the situation and concluded that further advance was too risky. On February 22nd, he ordered a withdrawal. By February 24th, the pass was back in Allied hands. The Battle of Kasserine Pass was over. The final toll was devastating. American casualties exceeded 6,500 men, including roughly 300 killed, 3,000 wounded, and more than 3,000 captured or missing. The army had lost 183 tanks, 104 half-track vehicles, 208 artillery pieces, and more than 500 other vehicles. German and Italian casualties were minimal by comparison, fewer than 1,000 total, with only about 200 killed. The casualty ratio was approximately 5-1 in favor of the Axis. General Omar Bradley, who witnessed the aftermath and would soon become one of the most important commanders in the American Army, called it probably the worst performance of the United States Army in their whole proud history. Now came the reckoning. Eisenhower was forced to confront the truth about his command structure. He flew to Tunisia to see the situation for himself. What he found appalled him. Fredendall's headquarters, that elaborate bunker complex, 70 miles from the fighting, was described by Bradley as an embarrassment to every American soldier. The tunnels that 200 engineers had spent 3 weeks blasting out of rock had never been bombed. The air attacks Fredendall feared had never materialized. He had wasted his engineering resources on a project that served no purpose, except to protect himself. Fredendall himself was clearly unfit for command. His decisions before and during the battle had been catastrophic. His relationship with his subordinates had made effective coordination impossible. When Major General Ernest Harmon was sent to assess the situation during the height of the crisis, Fredendall essentially gave up. He handed Harmon a sealed envelope containing written orders transferring command of the battle then in progress. "The party is yours," Fredendall said as he handed over the envelope. Then he went to bed and slept for the next 24 hours while his men were still fighting and dying. It was an act of abdication that stunned everyone who witnessed it. The question of what to do with Fredendall was delicate. He had powerful friends in Washington. George Marshall still believed in him. A public disgrace might damage army morale at a critical moment. The American public did not know the full extent of what had happened at Kasserine. The censors had limited press coverage of the defeat. In the end, Eisenhower found an elegant solution. Fredendall was relieved of command but promoted to lieutenant general. He was given a hero's welcome back in the United States and assigned to train new soldiers stateside, far from any combat command. It was a face-saving gesture that allowed the army to move on without a scandal. Privately, every officer who had served under Fredendall knew the truth. Patton recorded in his diary that, according to Harmon, Fredendall was a physical and moral coward. To replace Fredendall, Eisenhower chose a man who was in many ways his opposite. Major General George Smith, Patton Jr., was everything Fredendall was not. He was aggressive where Fredendall was cautious. He was visible where Fredendall was hidden. He believed in leading from the front rather than commanding from a bunker 70 miles behind the action. Patton arrived at 2nd Corps headquarters on March 6, 1943. At 10 o'clock in the morning, Fredendall was still eating breakfast. Patton took one look at the slovenly headquarters, the lax discipline, the demoralized officers, and understood exactly what needed to be done. The transformation of 2nd Corps began that very hour. Patton's methods were controversial then and remain so now. He imposed strict discipline on everything from combat formations to personal appearance. Soldiers were required to wear neckties in combat. Steel helmets were mandatory everywhere, even behind the lines. Men had to shave every day, regardless of battlefield conditions. Uniforms had to be complete and properly worn at all times. Violations brought immediate fines of $25, a significant sum when privates earned $50 a month. Officers who had grown comfortable with Fredendall's lax standards suddenly found themselves called to account for every unbuttoned collar and dirty uniform. Many soldiers grumbled. Some officers complained that Patton was obsessed with trivial details while there was a war to fight. But Omar Bradley, who served as Patton's deputy and would later command his own army group, understood what Patton was doing. Each time a soldier knotted his necktie, threaded his leggings, and buckled on his heavy steel helmet, Bradley wrote in his memoir, he was forcibly reminded that the pre-Kasserine days had ended and that a tough new era had begun. The necktie was not about neckties. It was about discipline, about attention to detail, about transforming a beaten force into a fighting army. If a man could not be bothered to dress properly, how could he be trusted to maintain his weapon, to stay at his post, to follow orders under fire? But Patton did far more than impose dress codes. He reorganized training to emphasize combined arms operations, ensuring that infantry, armor, and artillery worked together instead of fighting in isolation. He replaced obsolete equipment, swapping out ineffective 37mm anti-tank guns for more powerful British 6-pounder guns that could actually penetrate German armor. He brought in 75 experienced officers to replace those who had proven inadequate at Kasserine. He established proper coordination between ground forces and air support, creating the tactical air control systems that would prove decisive in later campaigns. He demanded speed in everything, rapid movement, quick decisions, and instant obedience to orders. He rebuilt 2nd Corps from the ground up. 10 days after taking command, on March 16, 1943, Patton summoned his officers. He had been working them relentlessly for more than a week. Now he was ready. "Gentlemen," he told them, "tomorrow we attack. If we are not victorious, let no one come back alive." It was melodramatic, perhaps even absurd. Bradley himself thought it was hammy. But it was also exactly what 2nd Corps needed to hear. These men had been defeated and humiliated. They needed to believe that victory was possible, that their commanding general would accept nothing less. Patton gave them that belief. The target was Guettar, a small oasis town that controlled a vital road network in southern Tunisia. On March 23rd, the attack began. The 1st Infantry Division, known as the Big Red One for the distinctive patch on their shoulders, moved against German positions. Supporting them was the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with half-track mounted guns designed specifically to kill tanks. They expected a hard fight. They got one. At 6 o'clock in the morning, 50 tanks of the German 10th Panzer Division counterattacked. This was the moment of truth for the reformed American Army. The 10th Panzer Division was one of the most formidable armored units in the Afrika Korps. They had crushed American forces at Kasserine. Now they came rolling out of the morning haze, confident that they would do so again. Would the Americans break and run as they had before? They did not. The Americans held their positions and fought back with devastating firepower. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion alone expended more than 50,000 rounds of ammunition in a single day of combat. American artillery pounded German assembly areas. Infantry held their ground despite intense pressure. By the end of the day, approximately 30 German tanks had been destroyed or disabled. The counterattack had failed. The Germans tried again in the late afternoon. A second armoured thrust, launched at 4:45 in the afternoon, was detected in advance thanks to American intelligence intercepts. Cryptographers had broken German communications codes. The Americans knew the attack was coming before it started. They were ready. The second assault was similarly repulsed. Meanwhile, 340 Allied air sorties struck German supply lines, adding to the Axis misery. For the first time in the war, American ground forces had defeated a major German armoured counterattack. When Eisenhower learned of the victory at Guettar, he sent a message that perfectly captured the transformation underway. "The Hun," he wrote, "will soon learn to dislike that outfit." He was right. The 10th Panzer Division, one of the most formidable units in the Afrika Korps, had been bloodied by the same American army it had routed just weeks before. The men who had fled through Kasserine Pass were becoming warriors. On April 7th, Benson Force, an American combat team pushing east from Guettar, linked up with advance elements of the British 8th Army coming from the east. The two Allied forces had squeezed the Germans between them. The noose around the remaining Axis forces in Tunisia was tightening, but the most remarkable American redemption still lay ahead. It would come on a rocky hill in northern Tunisia, a place called Jebel Tahent, better known as Hill 609 for its height in meters above sea level. This was where the 34th Infantry Division would restore its honor. The 34th was a National Guard division from Iowa and Minnesota. It had been among the first American divisions sent overseas. And it had suffered terribly at Kasserine. British commanders blamed the 34th for a failed attack at Field Pass, calling the division's performance disgraceful. Whether the criticism was fair or not, the 34th's reputation was in ruins. The division was considered unreliable, its soldiers thought to be cowards. When General Bradley needed someone to take Hill 609, he gave the mission to the 34th. It was both a challenge and an opportunity. "Get me that hill," Bradley told the division commander, Major General Charles Ryder. It was an order that carried with it the weight of the division's entire reputation. Hill 609 was a natural fortress. Rising 609 meters above the surrounding terrain, its steep, rocky slopes offered perfect defensive positions. The summit dominated every approach route. An attacker climbing those slopes would be exposed to fire from above for hundreds of meters. The hill was defended by Regiment Barenthin, elite Luftwaffe ground troops converted from Air Force personnel, Germans who knew they were fighting for their lives. They had dug in deep, fortified every advantageous position, and registered their artillery to cover every likely avenue of attack. The Americans who would attack this fortress were exhausted and sick. Many suffered severe reactions to atabrine, an anti-malarial drug that was mandatory in North Africa but caused debilitating side effects including nausea, headaches, and a yellow discoloration of the skin. They had been fighting for weeks without adequate rest. Their equipment was worn. Their casualties had already been significant. They attacked anyway. The battle for Hill 609 lasted from April 27th to May 1st, 1943. The fighting was brutal, often hand-to-hand. German defenders had to be cleared from every trench, every bunker, and every rock pile. Men who had been told they were cowards proved their courage a dozen times over. They climbed under fire. They charged positions that seemed impregnable. They died by the hundreds, but they kept coming. On April 30th, men of the 1st Battalion, 133rd Infantry Regiment, finally reached the summit. With them, in one of the most remarkable feats of the campaign, were Sherman tanks from the 1st Armoured Regiment. These 40-ton vehicles had somehow climbed slopes that seemed too steep for any tracked vehicle. Their crews had found paths where none should have existed and fought their way to the top. Now their guns added devastating firepower to the American defense of the summit. The Germans counterattacked repeatedly but could not dislodge the Americans. Hill 609 had fallen. Bradley's assessment was vindication for every man who had fought there. After the battle, he wrote that no one ever again would question the 34th Division's courage and that it had become one of the finest infantry outfits of World War II. The division that had been mocked as cowards had proven itself on the toughest ground in Tunisia. The transformation was complete. On May 7th, 1943, the British 8th Army entered Tunis, while American forces captured the port of Bizerti. The 1st Armoured Division, which had been shattered at Kasserine just 11 weeks earlier, conducted what became known as the Battle of the Mousetrap. Racing north to the Mediterranean coast at Porto Farina, they trapped thousands of retreating Axis soldiers. Over the final days of the campaign, the division captured more than 20,000 prisoners as the Axis position in Africa collapsed. The hunters had become the hunted. On May 13th, all remaining Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. More than 250,000 prisoners, including General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who had replaced Rommel, along with 11 other German and Italian generals, fell into Allied hands. The Tunisia Campaign was over. American casualties had exceeded 18,000 men. But the army that emerged from the campaign was fundamentally different from the one that had entered it. The lessons learned in Tunisia were applied immediately to the next operation. On July 10, 1943, Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, began. It was the largest amphibious assault in history to that point, involving 150,000 troops and more than 4,000 aircraft. The same units that had suffered at Kasserine now performed brilliantly. The 1st Infantry Division and the 2nd Armoured Division landed at Gela and beat off determined attacks by the Hermann Göring Panzer Division. These were veteran German troops, motivated and well-equipped. They failed to push the Americans back into the sea. Patton's 7th Army swept across western Sicily with stunning speed. They captured Palermo along with more than 50,000 prisoners while suffering fewer than 300 casualties. It was the kind of dramatic success that had seemed impossible just months before, and when British and American forces raced to capture Messina at the eastern tip of the island, the Americans won. Patton's troops entered the city on August 17th, hours before Montgomery's British forces arrived. The men the British had called their Italians had outperformed the British themselves. It was a vindication that Patton savoured. The broader consequences of Sicily were enormous. The island's fall triggered the overthrow of Benito Mussolini on July 25, 1943. Italy, Germany's primary ally, began to crumble from within. The confidence gained in Sicily carried forward to the Italian mainland and beyond. But the ultimate test would come on June 6, 1944, when American forces landed on the beaches of Normandy. At Omaha Beach, the bloodiest of the D-Day landing zones, the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one that had redeemed itself at Guettar, faced the most determined German resistance of the day. Everything went wrong. Of the 29 amphibious tanks launched to support the landing, 27 sank in the rough seas. Only 2 reached the shore. The naval bombardment that was supposed to suppress German defences had largely missed. The infantry hit the beach without the armoured support they had counted on and walked into a killing zone. Nearly 1,200 men of the 1st Infantry Division fell on that single beach in a single day. Yet the division pressed forward. Small groups of soldiers, led by sergeants and lieutenants when their officers fell, found ways up the bluffs. They knocked out German positions one by one. By nightfall, they had secured their objectives. It was exactly what they had learned to do in Tunisia and Sicily: adapt, overcome, and keep fighting regardless of circumstances. Nearby, the 29th Infantry Division lost 743 men fighting to get off the sand. At Pointe du Hoc, the 2nd Ranger Battalion scaled 100-foot cliffs under fire, using rope ladders and grappling hooks, while German defenders dropped grenades on their heads. Of the 225 Rangers who landed, fewer than 90 remained fit for duty 2 days later, the rest killed, wounded, or missing in one of the most daring assaults of the war. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the son of President Theodore Roosevelt, and the oldest man in the invasion at 56 years of age, landed with the first wave at Utah Beach. When he discovered his forces had been pushed off course by the current and landed in the wrong location, he made a decision that exemplified the new American army. "We'll start the war from right here," he declared. He personally led his men inland, walking with a cane due to a heart condition and arthritis, directing traffic under fire, a general doing the work of a captain because it needed to be done. He would receive the Medal of Honor for his actions that day. The army that landed in France was not the army that had fled through Kasserine Pass. It was a professional fighting force that had learned from its failures and transformed itself through sheer determination. When Operation Cobra broke out of the Normandy beachhead on July 25, 1944, 1,500 heavy bombers dropped 3,300 tons of explosives on German positions in a narrow corridor. The Panzerlehr Division, one of the finest German armoured units, was shattered by the bombardment, losing dozens of tanks and assault guns in a single morning. Patton's Third Army was activated on August 1st and exploited the breakthrough with characteristic aggression. Racing into Brittany, then wheeling east toward Paris, American armour moved faster than the Germans believed possible. The Falaise Pocket trapped nearly 100,000 German soldiers, of whom 50,000 were captured and 10,000 killed. Paris was liberated on August 25th. From there, the American army drove east toward Germany itself. The same soldiers who had been dismissed as amateurs less than 2 years before were now the dominant ground force in Western Europe. They crossed the Rhine, penetrated the Siegfried Line, and drove into the heart of the Reich. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, more than 3 million American soldiers were serving in the European theatre of operations. 61 of the 91 Allied divisions that defeated Nazi Germany were American. The nation that had ranked 19th in military power in 1939 had become the most powerful military force on earth. The Rommel Papers, published after the war with extensive commentary by British military theorist B. H. Liddell Hart, offered this assessment of the American Army's transformation. The Americans profited far more than the British from their experience in Africa. Even at that time, The American generals showed themselves to be very advanced in the tactical handling of their forces, confirming the axiom that education is easier than re-education. Whether these words were Rommel's own or Liddell Hart's interpretation, the judgment was accurate. The Americans had been poor students at the beginning, but they learned, and they learned faster than anyone expected. This is the true significance of Kasserine Pass. It was not simply a defeat, though it was certainly that. It was a crucible, a trial by fire that burned away the weaknesses of an unprepared army and forged something stronger in its place. The men who fled through that pass in February 1943 did not remain the men they were that day. They became something else. They became an army that could fight and win against the best soldiers Germany could field. They became an army that stormed beaches and liberated nations. They became an army that won a world war. The British who mocked them as their Italians eventually had to acknowledge the truth. The soldiers who ran from German panzers at Kasserine learned to destroy them at Guettar and Normandy and across the fields of France. Every army that has ever fought a major war has experienced disaster. What matters is what comes after the disaster. The Americans at Kasserine Pass could have been broken by their defeat. Instead, they were transformed by it. Today, Kasserine Pass remains a place of remembrance. The North Africa American Cemetery at Carthage holds the remains of nearly 3,000 Americans who died in the Tunisia Campaign and across North Africa. Each white cross and Star of David marks a man who gave his life in a cause that seemed hopeless in February 1943, but led to total victory by May 1945. They were not the perfect soldiers of legend. They were ordinary Americans who made terrible mistakes, learned from those mistakes, and kept fighting until they won. Consider the numbers. American battle deaths against Germany exceeded 176,000 men across all theaters. Total battle casualties, including killed, wounded, and captured, approached 750,000. These were the sons of farmers and factory workers, of shopkeepers and school teachers, young men who had never expected to see the mountains of Tunisia, or the beaches of Normandy, or the forests of the Ardennes. They came from every state, every background, and every circumstance, and they won. The men who survived Kasserine carried that experience with them for the rest of their lives. Many never spoke of it. The shame of those terrible February days was not something easily discussed over dinner tables back home, but those who did speak told of lessons learned in blood. They told of watching friends die because of mistakes that should never have been made. They told of running when they should have fought, and they told of the determination that seized them afterward, the cold resolution that it would never happen again. They had seen themselves at their worst. They refused to remain there. That is what Kasserine Pass means. Not just a battle lost, but a nation transformed. Not just a defeat, but the first step toward the greatest victory in American military history. When historians study the Second World War, they often focus on the great victories at Normandy, the Bulge, and the Rhine. But the seeds of those victories were planted in the wreckage of a narrow Tunisian pass, where American soldiers first learned what it meant to fight and lose and refuse to quit. The men who were there never forgot, and neither should we.